Hello, welcome to part 2 of this interview. We're talking to Jonathan Singer. He's the president of the American Association of Suicidology, but he's also an author. And one of the areas of specialty for him is suicide in schools. Jonathan, I want to start by asking you, are schools prepared to prevent, to intervene, and to deal with death by suicide?
Most schools are not prepared for it because the purpose of schools is to address education, learning, and schools are not designed, nor are they legislated to be responsible for the mental health of students. Now, that said, there's a growing number of states that have legislation that address the social emotional learning of students, and there are a growing number of states that have statutes about the importance of teachers and school mental health providers to be trained to identify and respond to suicide risk in youth. And one of the main reasons, of course, is that if you're wondering if the world would be better off without you, if you think that people wouldn't care if you lived or died, it's not likely that you're going to be doing so well on your math homework, or that you're going to really pay much attention to your social studies, right? So there's an acknowledgement that when kids are struggling with the things that lead to suicide, it also has a profound impact on their academics. And so for this reason, even though most schools are not prepared, there's a growing awareness that this is something that folks need to address.
Mm-hmm. The other day, I had a parent ask me, Paula, how do I know? How can I know whether or not my school has any kind of protocol or if they're ready to deal with this? Because we don't know. I mean, our kids, we drop them off and then we come pick them up. We don't know what's happening there. Many times, especially if they're a teenager, they'll come home and go to their rooms, right?
That's right.
So what kind of questions can parents ask the school just so they know?
Yeah, so one of the first ones is you can say, does the school district or does the school building have a suicide prevention policy and protocol? And if they do, then the parent has the right to see that. If they say, no, we don't, but we have, Mrs. Stevens, and she's been around for 30 years and she does everything. And you can say, so what does Mrs. Stevens do? And what happens when she retires, right? Or if she's sick and she's not available that day. Those are the two opposite ends of the continuum, right? You have schools where you have one person who's been doing this for a long time and everybody sort of goes to as the point person for when there's somebody in a suicidal crisis. And then you have the other side, which is school districts like the ones that I've worked with, like in Naperville in Illinois, which have a very comprehensive prevention, intervention, and postvention policy and protocol, where you have, hundreds of employees all working together to understand what's happening.
Let's say I am the dean or principal or in the administrative board of a school, and I want to be ready for this in these three areas, right? Prevention, intervention, if something is happening, so taking care of kids who are at risk, and also postvention. What are the steps that they can take?
Well, so the first thing to know is that there's not a single program that is comprehensive enough to address all of that. So even if you're doing prevention, there's not just one program that will allow you to do comprehensive prevention. There's this idea of screening, which is figuring out which students are thinking about suicide, right, that are most at risk. And once you screen, then you can do an assessment. But that means, who does the assessment? Is it somebody that is employed in your school, or do you have an agreement with like an outpatient community mental health clinic for somebody to come in and do the assessment? And then if they have to have some intervention, is there communication between maybe a therapist on the outside and school staff? So really thinking through what these steps are will help an administrator decide what they need to do. Now, there are programs, right? There's signs of suicide, there's QPR, there's assist, there are all of these trainings that people can take to help to do education and screening and then intervention. There's also postvention, which is how you address grief and loss after a death. And there are programs out there that address that, but really thinking through what are all the different steps and how do I first go about starting that. And that's one of the things that we do in our book, Suicide in Schools, is we go through all of the different things that people need to know about in order to develop their plan.
That's a very, I'll make sure that on my notes, I'll have your book and a link to your book. But one of the questions that I have, and I actually had a very good interview the other day with a person here, one of the counties here in Oregon, and she is responsible for the prevention program in schools. And something she told me that it just clicked to me, wow, that makes a huge difference, is who do you get involved in prevention? And what she did was very intelligent. Said, Paula, here we have, most of them are teenagers, and teenagers listen to their friends. They listen to teenagers. If I tell them what to do, if I talk to them about warning signs, risk factors, they'll go, yeah, it's one more adult telling me what to do. So what they do is they train the kids. They identify the leaders first. They call them to action, they invite them to participate, and they're so passionate. The kids love it because they feel empowered, and they are the ones who go into the classrooms and they talk about this. So do you have any other examples of things that could help? Because I think that's a big one, involving the kids in the process.
Yeah, so I think peer-to-peer services are incredibly powerful at any age, right? I know that when I work with parents of kids who are suicidal, the parents, they don't mind talking to me, but they'd much rather talk to another parent whose kid went through this and has come out on the other side, right? That's really who they want to talk to. And in the same way, you have groups like programs like Yellow Ribbon and Hope Squad that have this model of training peers to talk to peers. Now, one thing that I will say is that there's not a lot of research to suggest that this is effective. And in fact, there's some research to suggest that it's not effective to have peers be identified as the educators in terms of reducing suicide risk. Now, I hope that some of the new programs out, like Hope Squad, I'm very hopeful that as the research comes out, it will be shown to be effective. But right now, we don't have data that that's true. I think that some of the other programs that are out there that schools can look at are things like signs of suicide, which includes education. There's a video component. They use the ACT model, acknowledge, care, tell. It has a screening component. It does education for teachers. And this actually does have evidence that when high school students go through the program and it's implemented, that it reduces suicide attempts, right? So not just distress, but it actually reduces suicide attempts in high school students. And that's really powerful. And it's out there and available, and schools are using it.
Mm-hmm. What about intervention? So you do identify that there is a teenager or a child who has ideation. What do you do then? And one of the trickiest questions, I think, is when to involve or not to involve family members. Because when they're minors, that's easy. You have to. What if they're not?
Well, I think, parents, they always love their kids, even when the kids are adults. That doesn't go away. I think there can be a sense of disconnection or frustration with adult kids. Maybe a sense of, I've thrown my hands up. This has been going on for years. I just don't know what to do. But it's not because you don't love them or care about them. And so even with adult kids, what I always do is I always say, hey, look, especially if they're living with the parents or they're in the same town, I always say, look, this is really, your parents are going to be your main supports here. Unless they've told me that there's something dangerous about connecting with the parents, in which case that doesn't happen, but then say, I think it would be really helpful if we reached out to your parents. Would you like us to be on the phone together while we call your parents? Let's talk through how you're going to tell them what's going on. Let's talk about how I can support you in this. Right. So you make it part of the therapeutic contract. And like you said, with youth, absolutely, like you just have to do it. And so one of the recommendations for schools is that anytime you do a suicide risk assessment, reach out to the parents, unless there is an indication that reaching out to the parents to say we've assessed for suicide risk will actually put the kid at danger of abuse or neglect. But otherwise, reach out and say, hey, we talked to your kid, nothing came of it. We just wanted to let you know. Or something came of it, come on in. Let's talk. Let's talk about this. So absolutely got to involve the parents.
Should you get involved to other kids? Because with youth, we have a lot of concern in terms of contagion, right? So how can you involve them in a way that is not a copycat incentive?
So when you have, so contagion is this idea that when one kid dies by suicide, there are going to be other kids that die soon after, sometimes by the same method. And contagion is an experience that is fairly unique to adolescence. Like if you have, Bob is a 55-year-old office worker and he kills himself, you're not worried that Sam, who also works in the office, is then going to kill himself, right? So this is really an adolescent phenomenon. So there are a couple of things. One, you want to make sure that you've done your prevention work correctly, which means that you have addressed issues of warning signs for suicide. You've talked about what's going on with folks so that if, God forbid, there's a suicide death, you're able to turn back to that and say, we're really sad that so-and-so died. This is it's a tough time for all of us. We know that he was struggling with this, and we'd really like to reach out to you. We want you to connect with each other. We're doing these groups. We've got right. So you have something in place so that you can address the grief and loss. Now, what we know is that the folks who are the closest to the person who died in terms of youth are less likely to have increased suicide risk than the folks that are one step out, right? Because those folks that are on the outside layer, they're not going to see the pain that the family's feeling. They're not going to see the chaos and confusion that the peers are experiencing. All they're going to see is the community wrapping themselves around the loss. And if they're already at risk for suicide, they might think, oh, this is a way for people to care about me, because I don't feel like people care about me. And so it tends to increase risk. So having a plan in place where people can actually address it is going to be a really important thing in terms of changing the narrative around.
Yeah, because we often think about the parents, right? But they're the teachers who many times love these kids. They've been together. I mean, they've accompanied them all their lives. So we focus, of course, for obvious reason, and that's not wrong, on the family, but they're the staff who see this kid. They see them every day, who hand them their food. And so there is a whole community involved that could be at higher risk too, because of the emotional involvement.
Absolutely. No, we can't forget the staff and the teachers and everybody who's there. And what that means is that organizations have to be willing and able to have a crisis plan that says, if you were a kid's teacher and you need to take the next day off to manage your own emotions, we have a plan to step in. And we also have a plan to communicate that students that you are taking care of yourself because you care about them. Nothing bad has happened to you, but you'll be back the next day, right? That sort of thing. And that requires thinking through the crisis and it requires the planning.
Okay. And just to end this interview, Jonathan, what should they do in case a suicide happens? What is the best way to address that?
Well, the first thing in a school setting, are you talking specifically about schools?
Yeah.
So specifically in schools is that you have to make sure that the parents are willing and able to label the death as a suicide, because if the parents are saying, I know that my kid died by suicide, I know that you know that, but I don't want anybody else to talk about that,
It's their
then
choice.
you can't talk to students about how so-and-so killed himself. You can't say, Samantha died by suicide. You have to say, we're so sad that she's gone, right? And we're so sad to have lost a beloved member of the community. So this is where the crisis plan is really, or the postvention plan is really important. Typically, in most schools in the United States, there is you have to make a decision about how big of a response this is going to be. Was this a kid who transferred in 3 weeks ago that has no friends at the school, that has no siblings, right? That nobody in the community knows the family? Or is this somebody who is the third generation of students in this school district? And so the principal actually was the teacher of the parents, and they have siblings in other school buildings, and they're the captain of the football team. Like, how big is it, right? And so making the decision about what kind of response is a really important thing. Having resources set up, in New Jersey, they have the Traumatic Loss Coalition, which is a phenomenal organization where they come in and they do postvention work alongside staff to address the grief and loss. So they'll have meetings with students, 8 to 10 students at a time, talking about what happened, what do you know, how are you feeling, right? Your classic debriefing. They'll talk to the teachers, and then there'll be a plan, for the first 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. And then typically after the first week, there's this idea of we need to get back into the business of learning. Because if we draw this out, if we keep going, that in and of itself can be disruptive and traumatic to kids. So having a plan for how long to talk and how much to process and what to do next is really important. We discourage people from having permanent memorials, but rather to have short-term, meaningful experiences where people can honor and grieve together the loss of a kid that they loved and that they were in school with. And that could include everybody going to a funeral, right? But making sure that the parents are driving the kids, separately, not a busload full of kids going to a funeral. There's so many things that can happen, but really the idea is that the school administrators have a plan that they've worked out in advance with staff, and preferably with a group of community folks, both professionals and parents, to talk about, if we lose somebody, if a kid dies by suicide, how should we respond?
Should they create support groups, for example, even if it's short term, or should they just give parents and the staff resources for outside?
Well, again, it depends on how large the school is, how resourced it is, what sort of resources are in the community. There, many communities have hospice services where folks are trained in grief and loss, and they run groups for kids who've lost loved ones to suicide. I know that there are non-hospice related organizations. There's a place in Illinois called Willow House, and they run a group for kids who've lost somebody to suicide. And so knowing that those are resources can be really powerful for schools, because you could have the school social worker run a group, but it's only one social worker and it's only one group. And you might have folks that are right for the group. As Yalom likes to say, there's a group for everyone, right? It just might not be that this group is the right group for that person. So having those extra resources is really important.
Yeah, because so many times, especially with suicide, there's so much shame, and the stigma makes it difficult for them to talk, and the fear of contagion too. So maybe going outside that community will be beneficial in terms of you opening up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that having resources away can be incredibly powerful.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you for your time. And I will make sure to have a list of everything that you mentioned, all these resources on the notes. And I'm just very grateful for you being here, talking to me and to my precious audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paula. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here and talk with you. Thanks so much.